The relay bell rang at midnight with no stage in sight. Cal Ransom heard it from the back room of Dry Bell Station, where he had been sitting with his boots on, a cold cup of coffee beside him, and a route map spread across his knees. The bell was meant for incoming coaches. One sharp pull from the lane told the station hand to bring out a fresh team. But no driver called. No wheels came grinding over the hard road. Only a horse. It burst through the dark with foam on its neck and its saddle crooked, dragging one rein low enough to strike sparks against stone. The animal crossed the yard wild-eyed and struck the water barrel so hard the boards shook. Cal was outside before the bell stopped swinging. The station keeper, Auld Lem Pike, came stumbling from the tack room with a lantern in one hand and a shotgun in the other. "Stage?" Lem asked. "No." Cal took a step toward the horse, slow and angled, letting the animal see him. "Easy," he said. "Easy now." The horse snorted and sidestepped. But exhaustion had already done what rope could not. Cal caught the loose rein near the cheekpiece and held steady until the trembling eased. It was a good mare. Too good to be loose at midnight without trouble behind her. A woman's blue handkerchief was tied around the saddle horn. One corner had been pulled thin, as if someone had gripped it hard before letting go. Mud marked the stirrup leather. Not from the main road but from the low wash east of the station. Cal lifted the saddle flap. Something white was caught beneath it. A folded paper, damp at one edge, sealed with a broken ribbon. He opened it under Lem's lantern. The words were formal and ugly. Marriage agreement between Elise Kearney and Ansel Graft. The signature line for the bride was blank. Cal read it twice. Below it, in smaller writing, stood a clause, assigning household authority, cattle interest, and family guardianship upon completion of vows. Lem spat into the dust. "That ain't marriage," he said. "No," Cal answered. "It's a bill of sale wearing church clothes." The mare jerked her head toward the dark road, ears sharp. Then Cal heard it. Faint voices. Men calling across the night. Too far off for words. Close enough for urgency. Lem looked toward the sound. Kearney riders. Maybe. Best not get tangled in family business. Cal folded the agreement and looked once toward the dry wash. Years ago in Texas, he had heard a girl crying behind a closed barn door, and kept riding because the men outside told him it was family business. He had carried that sound longer than any scar. He would not carry another. "Keep the mare watered," Cal said. Lem's face tightened. "You going out?" "She came from somewhere. And whoever sent her running may be right behind." Cal took his coat from the rail and checked the lantern wick. "Then I had better find her first." He followed the tracks east, leading his own horse by the rein until the ground dropped toward the wash. The moon was thin. Sagebrush stood black against the sand. Twice, he crouched to read the marks. One horse stumbling. Then lighter steps. Bare boots or worn shoes. A person moving fast, favoring the left foot. The voices faded behind him. Cal went lower into the wash. "Elise Kearney," he called softly. No answer. He moved 3 more steps. A click came from the darkness. Not loud. A gun being cocked by hands that did not want to shake. Cal stopped. "I am not your brother," he said. From under the cut bank, a woman's voice answered. Hoarse and tight. "That is what a man says when he wants me to lower the gun. I do not need you to lower it." "Then why are you here?" "Your horse rang the relay bell." Silence. Then, "Is she hurt?" "Scared." "Not hurt bad." A shadow shifted beneath the bank. Cal could make out the shape of a woman pressed into the dirt. One hand holding a pistol, the other clutching a small ledger against her chest. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her riding skirt was torn near the hem. But her eyes were clear enough to measure him. He kept his hands open. "They are coming for that paper," she said. "I found it." Her grip tightened on the pistol. "I did not sign it." "I saw." "If they get it signed, I lose more than a name." Cal looked at the ledger. "What is in the book?" "My father's cattle count. Real numbers. Not the ones Wade gave Ansel Graft." A rider shouted somewhere above the wash. Elise flinched but did not lower the pistol. Cal stepped back, giving her room to stand if she chose. I know a way to Silver Creek that does not touch the main road, he said. You can ride my horse. I will walk beside. She stared at him. Why would you do that? Because you are holding the only thing those men fear. No, she said. I am holding the only thing they have not taken. That answer settled in him. Cal nodded once. Then hold it. Elise rose slowly from the cut bank, keeping the pistol low but ready. She did not take his arm. He did not offer it. At the top of the wash, he gave her the reins to his horse and stepped away so she could mount without his hands on her. Behind them, the relay bell moved once in the night wind. Ahead, the road to Silver Creek lay dark, narrow, and uncertain. Cal walked beside the horse with the unsigned marriage paper in his coat pocket. And Elise Kearney held the cattle ledger like it was the last honest piece of ground she had left. Silver Creek was waking when Cal Ransom brought Elise Kearney in from the East Road. The town was small enough for every window to matter. A blacksmith smoke rose behind the livery. The hotel porch still held last night's dust. A church bell sat quiet above the whitewashed chapel, waiting for Sunday or trouble. Whichever came first. Elise rode Cal's horse with the cattle ledger held tight against her ribs. Cal walked beside her, leading by the rein. That was the first thing people noticed. Not the torn hem of her skirt. Not the pale dirt on her cheek. Not the unsigned marriage paper folded in Cal's coat. They noticed that he was walking. Mrs. Ada Wren saw it from the doorway of her sewing shop. She was a tall woman with silver hair pinned hard beneath a black comb. And the whole town knew she could judge a man's character by how he crossed a street. She stepped down from the boardwalk. Cal Ransom, she said. That horse looks tired. And so does the woman on it. Cal stopped. Morning, Mrs. Wren. Is she in danger? Elise answered before he could. Yes. Ada looked at her, then nodded once. Good. I prefer a plain answer. She turned and opened her shop door. Come inside. Elise did not move. Cal loosened his hand from the rein and stepped back. Your choice. That mattered. Elise climbed down by herself, slower than pride wanted. Her legs nearly failed when her boots touched the dirt. But she held the ledger tight and walked into the sewing shop with her back straight. Ada gave her water first. Not question. Then a clean shawl. Still no questions. Only after Elise had washed the dust from her hands in a basin did Ada point toward the ledger. That yours? It was my father's. Does someone want it? My brother's. And Ansel Graft. Ada's mouth tightened at the name. Graft owns too much land for a man still hungry. Cal stood near the door, hat in hand. He had not sat. Elise noticed that too. Ada noticed everything. You got a room? She asked him. Not yet. Then get 2 at Jenkins's hotel. 2 rooms. 2 accounts. Her name on hers. Cal looked to Elise. She reached to her collar and unpinned a small brooch. The last thing of her mother's that had not been locked away at the Kearney ranch. A little silver leaf, bent at one edge. I'll pay for mine, she said. Cal's face gave away nothing. Jenkins will write it proper. The hotel keeper did not like unusual arrangements before breakfast. But Ada Wren entered behind them. And that settled him better than law. He wrote 1 room under Cal Ransom and the other under Elise Kearney. Elise watched the ink dry before she let go of the coin from the brooch. By noon, Silver Creek had begun to understand there was a story. It did not yet know the shape. That afternoon, Cal brought the unsigned marriage agreement to Silas Morrow, banker and attorney for the town. While Elise sat across from him with the ledger in her lap, Morrow read the paper slowly. His office smelled of dust, ink, and old money. This clause is ugly, he said. Is it legal? Elise asked. If signed and witnessed cleanly. It could be argued. I did not sign. No. That helps. Cal leaned against the wall. Can it force her back? Morrow glanced at Elise before answering. Only if men pretend family means ownership. Elise looked at him. That happens often, she said. Morrow did not deny it. That made him more honest than most. He opened another drawer and took out a county notice. There is a ranch east of town. Morrow Creek Place. Small. 300 acres. Taxes unpaid since winter. Owner left for Idaho after losing half his herd. I was going to put it up for sale next week. Cal straightened. Elise's fingers tightened around the ledger. Why tell us? Because a woman with a cattle book in her arms is not usually running from nothing. Before more could be said, hooves sounded outside. 2 riders stopped in front of the hotel. Elise knew them by the way they dismounted. Wade Kearney did not come first. He never entered a town without making someone else test the ground. Bren came beside him. Broad-shouldered. Uneasy. Eyes searching the street. Elise. Bren called. Come out. We need to talk. Cal moved toward the door. Elise stood faster. No. He stopped. She passed him. Ledger still in hand. And stepped onto the boardwalk. Wade saw her and smiled like a man correcting a misbehaving horse. There you are. He said. You scared half the county. Not enough of it. Bren looked at the bruise-colored shadow under her eye and looked away. Wade's gaze moved to Cal. This man interfering with family business. Elise answered. Voice steady enough for the boardwalk to hear. I asked for distance. He gave it. Wade's smile thinned. You are overwrought. That agreement with Graft is the only thing keeping Kearney land from debt sale. That land has cattle enough to survive if you stop lying in the count. For the first time, Wade looked at the ledger. Not at her. At the book? That told Cal everything. Ada Wren crossed the street carrying a folded cloth bundle as if she had business elsewhere. She stopped beside Elise and held out the bundle. Dress needs mending, she said. Come by when you have time. Inside the cloth was the unsigned agreement. Ada had slipped it from Morrow's desk before Wade saw it. A small act. A sharp one. Wade looked from one face to another and found no easy door. This is not finished, he said. Elise held the ledger against her chest. No, she said. It has only started. As her brothers rode out, Cal saw Wade turn once toward the banker's office. By evening, Ada unfolded the agreement under lamplight and frowned at the witness line. Elise saw the name before anyone spoke. Miles Kearney. Her youngest brother. The only one she had still wanted to believe in. The ink sat there clean and dark, waiting to break her heart. The Morrow Creek place had no brand on the gate. That was the first thing Elise noticed. The second was the water. A narrow creek ran below the house. Thin, but moving. Cutting a clean line through winter-browned grass. Cottonwoods stood along both banks. Bare-limbed and quiet. The house was small. 2 rooms below and a loft above. With a stone chimney leaning just enough to make a man wonder, but not enough to make him leave. The barn had weathered hard seasons. Still, it stood. Cal Ransom reined in beside the empty gate post and looked at Elise before he looked at the land. She kept the cattle ledger in her lap. Silas Morrow, banker and attorney, climbed down from his wagon with a folded tax notice in hand. 300 acres. Morrow said. Creek holds most years. Barn needs work. House needs roof patching. 42 head included if the sale goes through. Not fine stock. But not useless. Elise looked across the pasture. The cattle were lean. But they moved well. No drag in the hind legs. No hollow stare. The winter had marked them. But not broken them. They need salt, she said. Morrow glanced at her. They do. And the lower fence has a gap. See where they keep drifting toward the draw. Cal looked. He had not seen it. Morrow did. A small nod passed through the banker's face. You know, cattle, he said. I know what men miss when they're counting only price. Cal said nothing. But the corner of his mouth shifted once. They walked the land until noon. The smokehouse needed chinking. The root cellar was dry. The well bucket was cracked but usable. In the barn, dust lay thick over old tools. Broken harness. And one rusted branding iron hanging from a nail. Elise reached for it. Cal stepped forward. Then stopped himself before warning her about rust or sharp edges. She noticed. That mattered more than the warning would have. The iron was shaped in an old mark. Half circle with a bar through it. A dead man's brand. No longer registered. If Morrow's paper was true. Who owned this place? Elise asked. Silas Greer. Morrow said. Lost his wife. Lost cattle in a hard freeze. Took what money he could and went north. Left taxes behind. Brand expired. Not renewed. Elise turned the iron in her hand. If the brand isn't registered. The cattle are loose on paper. For 30 days after sale. Morrow said. After that. Anyone with money and nerve can make trouble. Cal looked toward the creek. Ansel Graft has both. Morrow folded the notice back into his coat. That is why I brought you today instead of next week. They returned to the house and sat at the kitchen table under a window clouded with dust. Morrow named the price. Cal had enough for the down payment. Elise did not. She placed her father's cattle ledger on the table but did not open it. I will not live here as charity. She said. No one asked you to. Cal answered. My labor has value. So does what I know. If this place runs, it will not be because one man paid a banker. Morrow watched her with a lawyer's patience. What do you want written? He asked. Elise looked at Cal. He did not answer for her. That was the third thing that mattered that day. I want a partnership deed. She said. Cal Ransom holds cash interest for the down payment. Elise Kearney holds earned interest through cattle management. Household labor. Garden. Records. And first-year profit. After the first cattle sale. My share becomes fixed on paper. Morrow's eyebrows lifted. That is uncommon. So is being traded into marriage with cattle. Cal's eyes sharpened. But he did not interrupt. Morrow took out his pencil. Uncommon does not mean impossible. They were still drafting terms when a rider came up the lane. He wore Ansel Graft's red-neck scarf. He did not dismount. Mr. Morrow. The rider called from the yard. Mr. Graft will pay full asking price today. Cash. He says no need to trouble these folks with a hard place. The words sat in the kitchen like smoke. Morrow closed the folder slowly. This place is already under negotiation. Mr. Graft said you'd say that. The rider's eyes moved to Elise. He also said some women mistake a room for freedom until the bill comes due. Cal stood. Elise put one hand on his sleeve. Not to hold him back. To remind him she was still there. She stepped onto the porch. Tell Ansel Graft if he wants land. He can buy land not already spoken for. The rider smiled without warmth. Spoken for ain't the same as owned. No. Elise said. That is why men like him like paper better than truth. The rider's smile faded. He turned his horse and left. Only when hoofbeats dropped beyond the cottonwoods did Cal speak. You still want this place? Elise looked at the creek. The empty gate. The barn with its rusted iron. The house that needed work and did not yet know her name. I want a place no man can hand me away from. Morrow returned to the table. By late afternoon, the down payment was recorded. The partnership terms written. And the sale held pending brand registration. Cal took the smaller room in the house to store supplies. Elise chose the room with the back window facing the creek. That evening, Cal carried his bedroll to the bunkhouse. Elise stood on the porch. There is room inside. I know. You do not have to sleep out there to prove a point. I am not proving it. He said. I am keeping it. She had no answer ready for that. After he walked away, Elise went back into the barn and lifted the old branding iron from its nail. Near the handle, under rust and soot, someone had carved a small mark. A gate. Open at one side. She held it to the lantern and felt the first edge of hope turn dangerous. If they did not register a new brand within 30 days, Graft could make a claim on the cattle. And if Graft claimed the cattle, the ranch would become another cage with better scenery. The letter from Miles Kearney came 3 days after Elise chose the room facing the creek. It arrived folded twice. Carried by the Silver Creek Post rider. And left at Ada Wren's sewing shop, because everyone in town understood by then that Ada's counter was safer than the hotel desk. Elise read it standing behind a rack of plain work dresses. Elise. I need to see you. I have things to say that cannot be trusted to paper. I will come alone if you allow it. Miles. She read the words again. Miles had been the youngest. The quietest. The one who used to bring her broken tack because he knew she would fix it without laughing. If there had been one brother she had wanted to forgive before he asked, it was Miles. But his name sat on the witness line of the marriage agreement. Clean black ink. A clean lie hurt worse than a messy one. Ada watched from the cutting table. You do not have to answer today. I know. But knowing a thing was not the same as resting inside it. By noon, Wade Kearney rode into Silver Creek with Bren at his side and a folded copy of the marriage agreement in his coat. He did not go to the hotel first. He went straight to Silas Morrow's office, where Cal Ransom and Elise had come to sign the final partnership language for Morrow Creek Ranch. Wade removed his hat slowly, as if manners could cover the shape of what he meant to do. Elise, he said. You have made this harder than it needed to be. She stood beside Morrow's desk, cattle ledger under one arm. For who? For all of us. Bren looked thinner than before. He would not meet her eyes. Wade placed the copied agreement on the desk. This document carries a family witness and intent. If you keep hiding behind the scout, we will file complaint for interference and improper influence. Cal's face went still. Elise felt him shift beside her. One half step forward. She spoke before he could. I am not hiding. Wade tapped the witness line. Miles saw the agreement. He understood the necessity. You were the only one too stubborn to see it. Elise stared at the name. Her throat tightened. But her voice held. Where is Miles? Home. Where you should be. Morrow picked up the paper. This is a copy. It is enough to prove family position. It proves ink. Morrow said. Not consent. Wade's eyes sharpened. Careful. Banker. Graft can make life difficult for men who mistake themselves for judges. The room chilled around the words. Then the telegraph boy pushed open the door. Wire for Mr. Ransom, he said. Elise turned. Cal's jaw tightened before he took it. That was how she knew. What wire? She asked. Cal looked at the yellow slip. Elise. What wire? He handed it to her. It was from the medicine bow clerk, answering a question Cal had sent without telling her. It mentioned cattle transfer dates, witness record, and a filed claim under Ansel Graft's name. Elise read it once. The words blurred. Not from fear. From anger. You sent for this? Yes. Without asking me. I thought if we could prove. You thought. The room went quiet. Wade saw the crack and smiled. Elise folded the wire carefully. Because if she did not, her hands might shake. My brothers decided for me because they said it was necessary. She said. You decided for me because you said it was right. Cal looked as if she had struck him. But she had not raised her voice. That made the truth worse. I was trying to help, he said. I know. She picked up the cattle ledger and the copied agreement. That is the trouble. She left Morrow's office before anyone could stop her. Cal did not follow. That was the first thing he did right that day. By evening, Elise had taken the back room behind Ada Wren's shop. Ada gave her a cot, a basin, and no advice. On the chair beside the cot sat the cattle ledger, the agreement copy, and the wire that had proved both useful and unforgivable. Outside, Silver Creek settled into lamplight. Across town, Cal rode out alone to Morrow Creek Ranch. He did not pack Elise's things. He did not touch her room. He went to the front gate and fixed the latch she had mentioned 2 days earlier. The one that dragged low and would not close clean. He worked by lantern until the metal sat straight and the gate opened without catching. Then he left it open. Not wide. Just enough to show it would not be locked from his side. Near midnight, Ada woke Elise with a hand on the doorframe. There is someone in the alley, she said. Young man. Says, his name is Miles. Elise rose, heart hard and unsteady. Miles Kearney stood behind the shop with mud on his boots and ink on 2 fingers of his right hand. His horse was tied near the rain barrel. He looked cold, frightened, and older than the brother she remembered. Elise, he said. She held the copied agreement out under the lantern. Is this your signature? Miles looked at the witness line. His face went pale. No. Elise did not move. He swallowed. That is not my hand. His voice cracked. But he kept going. Wade made me copy Ansel Graft's name into the cattle book once. Said it was practice for cleaner records. I thought it was for the sale count. I did not know he used it for this. Behind Elise, Ada Wren stepped into the alley, with her shawl pulled tight. Miles looked at both women and took a folded page from inside his coat. I brought my church registry signature. Reverend Hale made me sign when I joined last spring. Compare it. Please. Elise took the page. For the first time in days. The anger in her chest found a direction. Not at Miles. Not all of it. At the hand that had learned to use every person around her like a tool. Miles wiped his ink-stained fingers on his coat and looked toward the dark road. Wade is coming tomorrow with Graft's man. He said. They mean to make the town choose before you can register that brand. Elise looked down at the two signatures. One real. One false. Then she looked toward the east. Where Morrow Creek waited with its gate fixed open in the dark. By morning. Silver Creek knew there would be trouble at the church. Not the shouting kind. Worse. The kind that came with papers folded in coat pockets. Men standing too straight. And women watching from windows without pretending not to. Ada Wren opened the church parlor herself and set 2 oil lamps on the long table. Reverend Pike brought down the registry book from the shelf behind the pulpit. Silas Morrow arrived with the partnership deed tucked under his arm. The sheriff came last. Unhappy to be present, and more unhappy that half the town already knew why. Elise Kearney stood at the end of the table with her father's cattle ledger in front of her. Miles stood beside the stove. Hat in both hands. Cal Ransom waited near the wall. Not beside Elise. Not in front of her. Near enough if she asked. Far enough that no one could call his voice hers. Wade Kearney entered with Bren and a narrow-faced man who wore Ansel Graft's redneck scarf under his coat. The man introduced himself as Mr. Voss. Legal representative. He spoke softly, which made him more dangerous than if he had shouted. This matter is family and property both. Voss said. Miss Kearney's brothers seek only to protect an arrangement made for the survival of their ranch. Ada Wren looked over her spectacles. A woman's life is not a fence post. Voss smiled politely. No one suggested it was. Elise opened the copied marriage agreement and placed it on the table. Then let us discuss why this paper treats me like one. No one laughed. Reverend Pike adjusted the lamp. Wade's face hardened. That agreement saved Kearneyland. No. Elise said. It moved me and the cattle into Ansel Graft's hands. Because you would not listen to sense. I listened. That was the trouble. She turned to Miles. The room seemed to lean toward him. Miles swallowed once. Then stepped forward with the church registry page he had brought from Medicine Bow. His fingers were still stained faintly with ink. I did not sign as witness. He said. Wade made a sharp sound. Miles. His younger brother flinched but did not step back. I should have stopped more than I did. Miles said. I should have stood with Elise before she had to run. I did not. But I did not sign that line. Ada took the registry page and set it beside the agreement. She pointed with one thin finger. The M in Miles turns differently. The K has a break in the witness copy. The registry line is steady. The witness line is careful in the wrong places. Reverend Pike bent over both pages. That is not the same hand. He said. The sheriff looked at Wade. Wade's jaw worked once. Handwriting is not law. No. Silas Morrow said. Laying a yellow telegraph slip on the table. Dates are. Elise had not known Cal would send another wire through Morrow this time. With her permission. She had written the question herself. The answer had arrived before dawn from the Medicine Bow clerk. Morrow read it aloud. The cattle transfer to Ansel Graft had been filed 2 days before the agreement showed any witness. 2 days before Elise was supposedly willing. 2 days before Miles was supposed to have seen consent. The church parlor held its breath. Elise looked at Wade. You sold the herd before you had me. Wade looked older under the lamp. Not sorry. Not yet. Cornered. The ranch was sinking. He said. You know it was. Pa left debt. Weather took calves. Graft offered a way out. I offered a way out. Elise said. Sell 20 head. Keep the breeding stock. Lease the west pasture for sheep. Cut winter waste. You laughed. You were a girl. I was the one keeping the books. Bren shut his eyes. That small act moved through the room more strongly than a speech. A brother who had said too little finally had no place to hide. Voss gathered the agreement. Even if there are irregularities, Mr. Graft may still pursue civil claim regarding cattle value and business expectation. Cal moved then. Only one step. He placed the Morrow Creek partnership deed on the table and stepped back. Voss glanced at it. What is this? Elise put her palm flat on the deed. My future. She read the first lines herself. Her name. Her labor interest. Her right to records. Cattle management. And first-year profit. Her right to choose whether she stayed or left. Her voice did not tremble. When she finished, she looked at the sheriff. Can that agreement take me back to Medicine Bow? The sheriff rubbed his thumb along the brim of his hat. No. He said. Not with no signed consent and a witness line under dispute. Can that cattle transfer stand? Morrow answered. It can be held pending fraud inquiry. Wade struck the table with his hand. The lamp flame jumped. No one else did. Ada Wren reached out and steadied the lamp with 2 fingers. That was how the room answered him. Wade looked at Elise then. And for one moment, she saw not the brother who had ordered her life, but the frightened man under him. Terrified of losing land, he had never learned to love properly. I was trying to save home, he said. Elise folded the cattle ledger closed. You nearly sold mine to do it. Silence followed. Not empty. Finished. Voss took the agreement back. But it no longer looked powerful in his hand. It looked like paper waiting for a court to ask hard questions. The sheriff told Wade and Bren to stay in town until the matter was reviewed. Graft's man left without offering his arm to anyone. Outside, cold mud clung to the church steps. Miles stood beside Elise in the gray light. I do not expect forgiveness, he said. Good. She answered. He nodded. Hurt but accepting it. Then he looked toward the road. Graft will strike at the new ranch next. The brand deadline. Cal's eyes lifted to Elise. She already knew. Winning her freedom had not secured the cattle. If they failed to register the new brand before Graft filed claim, Morrow Creek could become another fight before it ever became a home. Elise stepped down from the church porch with the ledger under her arm. Then we ride to the brand office, she said. This time, Cal did not ask if she was sure. He only brought her horse. The brand office sat behind the livery, in a room that smelled of ink, old leather, and stove smoke. Elise Kearney stood at the counter with her father's cattle ledger under one arm and the old branding iron wrapped in canvas on the boards before her. Cal Ransom stood near the door. Miles waited outside with the horses, hat in both hands, as if he had learned that apology did not end when the words were spoken. The clerk turned the old iron over. Friermark, he said. Expired last spring. I am not registering it again. Elise said. The clerk looked up. She took a pencil and drew the mark she had chosen. A small open gate. One side unbarred. That is the brand. Not a family initial. No. Not Ransom. No. Cal's eyes moved to her. But he did not speak. The clerk dipped his pen. Name of holding. Morrow Creek Partnership. Elise said. Elise Kearney and Cal Ransom. The pen scratched across the county brand book. It was a small sound. To Elise. It carried farther than any bell. Before noon, the open gate mark was recorded. Silas Morrow filed the partnership deed beside it, with Elise named as adult partner and record holder in her own right. The sheriff, still stiff from having been forced to do his duty in public, posted a hold notice, refusing any cattle movement under Ansel Graft's disputed transfer. That notice went up outside the livery. A freighter read it, folded his tobacco paper, and changed his team toward the south road instead of Graft's yard. By supper, 2 cattle buyers had asked Morrow whether stock under Graft's claim could be used as collateral. Morrow gave both men the same answer. Not while fraud was pending. That was how Ansel Graft began losing ground. Not by a bullet. By cattle that could not move. Paper that could not borrow. and men who suddenly wanted cleaner records before shaking hands. Wade Kearney returned the copied pages from her father's ledger through Miles the next week. He sent no letter. Only the pages. Wrapped in brown cloth and tied with twine. Elise counted every one. All there. She placed them with the original ledger and locked the box herself. Wade had lost the right to speak for her. Graft had lost the right to move her cattle. Neither loss healed the past. But both were now written where men could not pretend otherwise. The cattle at Morrow Creek were marked 3 days after the brand was recorded. The work was hard and slow. Smoke drifted low across the pen. The animals pressed against the rails. Restless under the cold spring light. Elise stood through all of it, reading each count aloud while Cal and Miles worked the gate. By sundown, the open gate mark rested on every animal that belonged to the partnership. When the last steer moved through, Elise closed the ledger and held it against her coat. The ranch was still poor. That truth did not change, because ink had dried. The barn leaked near the west beam. Feed ran low enough that Cal rode twice to Silver Creek to bargain for hay. Elise sold 6 weak steers before they became a loss and used the money for seed, salt, and roof nails. Miles stayed 4 days and mended the lower fence where the creek bent east. He did not ask Elise to forgive him. That helped. He worked until his gloves wore through, ate supper quietly, and left before dawn on the 5th day. On the kitchen table, he left her mother's locket. Elise opened it once, saw the small portrait inside, and closed it again. She placed it in the top drawer. Not ready to wear. Not willing to throw away. That was the place grief could have for now. Winter came early that year. Morrow Creek learned them both. It learned Cal's steady hands and Elise's sharp records. It learned which fence line failed in ice and which corner of the root cellar stayed cold without freezing. It learned that a ranch did not become home because a paper said so. It became home because people kept returning to the work. Cal learned to ask before acting. Sometimes he forgot. When he did, Elise only had to look at him. And he would stop, remove his hat, and begin again with the question he should have asked first. One cold evening, after snow had sealed the north road, Elise walked to the gate. The latch moved clean under her hand. Cal had fixed it the night she left him standing with his mistake. And he had never mentioned it since. She tied a blue ribbon around the iron. Cal saw it at dawn. He stood by the gate for a long while before coming back to the house. "You staying?" he asked. Elise looked past him toward the creek. The barn. The cattle moving slow under pale morning light. "I chose the brand," she said. "I chose the deed. I chose this place." Then she looked at him. "And I am choosing you. If you ask properly." Cal took off his hat. "Elise Kearney," he said. "May I court you with the aim of marrying you? If the winter does not prove me too foolish." She almost smiled. "The winter already knows you are foolish." "That a yes. That is permission to try." He nodded. And the warmth in his face said more than a speech would have. They married in Silver Creek after the thaw. It was a small ceremony in the church parlor where the false agreement had lost its power. Ada Wren stood beside Elise. Miles came and stayed near the back. Bren sent a letter. Wade sent nothing. That was answer enough. Elise wore a plain blue dress and no locket. At her throat was the same blue ribbon that had once hung from the gate latch. Cal gave her no promise of ownership dressed as protection. He promised partnership. That was the vow she needed to hear. After the service, the church bell rang once over Silver Creek. Clear and plain. Outside, spring mud clung to wagon wheels. The town did not look cleaner for what had happened there. But it looked more honest. That evening, Elise and Cal rode back to Morrow Creek. At the gate, the open brand had been burned clean into a new cedar board. Beneath it, the latch swung easy. Inside the house, Elise opened the drawer where she had kept the old marriage agreement. The paper was creased now. Handled too many times by too many people who had mistaken it for power. She did not burn it. She did not tear it. She folded it once and placed it beneath the partnership deed. Then she closed the drawer. Outside, the creek moved softly through the pasture. The cattle bore the open gate mark. Smoke rose from the chimney of the house she had chosen. Cal stood beside the hitching rail. waiting for her to decide when to come in. Elise touched the blue ribbon at her throat. Once, men had tried to trade her for a ranch. Now she stood on land that carried her name. Beside a man who had learned that love was not a hand closing around her. It was a gate left open. And her own choice to walk through. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.